Now let's talk about Hue. Hue is not something you're going to see if you're using a Hortonworks distribution of Hadoop like we are in this course, but if you're using Cloudera, you will use it a lot. Hue stands for Hadoop User Experience, cute little acronym. And to give you some background of what Hue is all about, basically there are two main competitors in the space of commercially supported Hadoop distributions. Cloudera is actually the number one package at the moment, at the time that I'm recording this at least, and Hortonworks is number two. And there's also a third one called MapR that's worth talking about as well. But they both have their own unique spin on things. So with Hortonworks, we've looked at Ambari as our primary management console and also the user interface that we use for issuing queries and browsing our HDFS file system and whatnot. It also includes Zeppelin out of the box for doing notebook-style analysis on your data. Now Cloudera, on the other hand, uses a utility called Hue instead. And Hue is something developed by Cloudera for Cloudera. It is technically open source, but it's really made for Cloudera. Now it's not exactly the same thing as Ambari. So there's basically a combination of two things on Cloudera that takes the place of Ambari and Zeppelin on Hortonworks. With Cloudera, you have Hue, which is the user interface used for querying things and notebook interactions and also for browsing your HDFS file system. But for the cluster management piece of Ambari, that's actually taken care of by something called Cloudera Manager. So you can kind of think of Hue as the analog to Ambari on Cloudera, sort of. I mean, they're not exactly the same thing, but conceptually they serve the same purpose. It's sort of your primary user interface to the cluster as a whole. What's the difference between Cloudera and Hortonworks? Well, the main difference is that Hortonworks is a 100% open source solution, whereas Cloudera kind of injects some of its own proprietary tweaks to the system of its own. Now, that can be a good thing in some cases, as we'll see. I mean, there are some really cool features of Hue that are really nice to have that I wish we had on Hortonworks, so not necessarily a bad thing, and that's probably why Cloudera is actually a bit more popular at the moment. But for the purpose of this course, I wanted to stick with completely open source stuff, hence the choice of Hortonworks, which is number two, but a close number two, I believe. One cool thing about Hue that I really like is that it has a built-in Oozie editor. So when we looked at Oozie, we had a pretty hard time of actually setting up everything we needed to do. We had to hand tweak XML files and set up property files and all sorts of nonsense, and it just wasn't easy to set up a workflow in Oozie. But with Hue, they do make it easy. They have this graphical editor where you can create workflows, coordinators, and bundles right from a web browser using the user interface. So this makes it a lot easier to set up new workflows on your cluster that chain together different tasks that you might be running, and also to monitor them and schedule them going forward. So it's always good when things are a little bit easier, right? It just sort of encourages more use of the system when there's not these huge barriers to using it. And like Ambari, it also offers interfaces to other systems like Pig, Hive, and HDFS and Scoop. And it also offers a view into HBase and Spark where you can issue queries through the UI. So the Spark interface is kind of like the Zeppelin notebook. And notebooks are built in as part of Hue. You don't need to use Zeppelin as an extra add-on for, playing around with Spark jobs, for example. So it's a little bit more of an integrated solution from that standpoint. Like I said, Hue is open source. You can get the source code, but it's not managed by Apache. It's maintained by Cloudera and hosted by Cloudera. I've seen that it can be installed on a Hortonworks distribution if you really try hard enough, but I've seen a lot of people having issues with that as well. So not necessarily something I would recommend doing. However, we can still fiddle with it a little bit. They have a live demo on their website where you can just kind of play around with a open installation of Hue and see what it can do. So let's go do that. So let's just take a quick look at Hue just so it doesn't look foreign to you if you run across a Cloudera installation at some point, which you are likely to. You can go to gethue.com to check it out. And that is the official Hue webpage, and you can see it has a much more corporate and polished look than your typical open source product. And well, like I said, that's because it's backed by a commercial company, Cloudera. And if we go to, let's see, play with a live demo, let's do that. And you can sign in as demo and demo. That's down here if they ever change it. So let's just kind of like play around a little bit here and see what Hue has to offer. This is what the UI looks like, and they have a bunch of different samples you can look at and play with. So for example, if we open up the examples under My Documents in Hue, there's a fork Oozie workflow we can look at. And This is really my favorite thing about Cloudera's implementation of Hue. You can actually set up your own Oozie workflows using a GUI, which I think is really wonderful. So, you know, it definitely beats hacking XML files and tracking down problems in them. So here you can see they set up a very simple example of running a pig script and another workflow and using Spark apparently in parallel using a fork node. So you start, go to a fork node, run a pig job, run a Spark job, do a join, and do an end. So very trivial example, but it shows you how you can construct an actual workflow in Oozie, and you can also construct coordinators and bundles as well. So just to refresh your memory, coordinators actually schedule workflows for you on a periodic basis, and bundles are basically collections of coordinators that you can manage all together. So I think that's kind of awesome. Let's go check out, I don't know, let's go back to the home here. And if we go to query editors, we can look at some saved samples here. Let's look at their Hive examples. So you can see what the Hive query editor looks like in Hue. You know, conceptually, it's the same thing as Ambari's Hive editor. You know, different layout, different look and feel, but does the same thing basically. So for example, we can go select this little select statement that somebody else did previously. And what's it doing here? Looks like it's actually querying some database of professions and their salaries, and selecting any professions that have a salary greater than $50,000 and sorting them in descending order so we can see the top paying professions out there. And we can actually click the little play button here to execute it, and it will actually go off and do its thing. So this is really a real installation of Hue that is read-only, so I can't, you know, create my own jobs or anything, but I can query this data and actually run my own queries on this data, so I could tweak that a little bit if I wanted to. This is a huge publicly accessible system, so I would hope this would actually run a little bit more quickly on a real private cloud. But let's give it a minute here, see if it actually comes back. Well, after 13 minutes, this is still running, so I assume this public Hue installation is under very heavy load right now, but really, I just wanted to show you what it looks like. So if you actually find yourself looking at Hue at a Cloudera installation at some point, it won't look totally foreign. So again, it does a lot of the same things Ambari and Zeppelin does without the management part of your cluster. So you're not actually going to be spinning up and installing services from Hue, but all the other stuff, this is basically Cloudera's answer to Ambari. And you can see it is a little bit more polished. You know, I will say it's a little bit easier on the eyes, and that tends to be the main difference between truly open source projects and things that have some sort of corporate involvement. You know, if you remember how beautiful Presto was, which came out of Facebook, compared to some other systems like Drill, well, they tend to have some actual user interface designers on staff for this sort of a thing. So that's that involvement tends to show. So there you have it. That's what Hue looks like. So now you know what to expect if you're on a Cloudera system. Well, let's move on.